The Sound of Thunder by Wilbur Smith. This book is for my children, Sean and Lawrence and Christian Lorry. Chapter 1. 4 years of travel in the roadless wilderness had battered the wagons. Many of the wheel spokes and disselbooms had been replaced with raw native timber. The canopies were patched until little of the original canvas was visible. The teams were reduced from 18 to 10 oxen each, for there had been predators and sickness to weed them out. But this exhausted little caravan carried the teeth of 500 elephant, 10 tons of ivory, the harvest of Sean Courtney's rifle, ivory that he would convert into nearly 15,000 gold sovereigns once he reached Pretoria. Once more, Sean was a rich man. His clothing was stained and baggy, crudely mended. His boots were worn almost through the uppers and clumsily resoled with raw buffalo hide. A great untrimmed beard covered half his chest, and a mane of black hair curled down his neck to where it had been hacked away with blunt scissors above the collar of his coat. But despite his appearance, he was rich in ivory, also in gold held for him in the vaults of the Volkskas Bank in Pretoria. On a rise of ground beside the road, he sat his horse and watched the leisurely plodding approach of his wagons. It is time now for the farm, he thought with satisfaction. 37 years old, no longer a young man, and it was time to buy the farm. He knew the one he wanted, and he knew exactly where he would build the homestead, sited close to the lip of the escarpment, so that in the evenings he could sit on the wide stoep and look out across the plain to the Tugela River in the blue distance. "Tomorrow early we will reach Pretoria," the voice beside him interrupted his dreaming, and Sean moved in the saddle and looked down at the Zulu who squatted beside his horse. "It's been a good hunt, Mbijani." "Nkosi, we have killed many elephant." Mbijani nodded, and Sean noticed for the first time the strands of silver in the woolly cap of his hair. No longer a young man either. "And made many marches," Sean went on, and Mbijani inclined his head again in grave agreement. "A man grows weary of the trek," Sean mused aloud. "There's a time when he longs to sleep 2 nights at the same place. And to hear the singing of his wives as they work in the fields," Mbijani carried it further, "and to watch his cattle come into the kraal at dusk, with his sons driving them. The time has come for both of us, my friend. We're going to go home, to Ladyburg." The spears rattled against his rawhide shield. As Mbijani stood up, muscles moved beneath the black velvet of his skin, and he lifted his head to Sean and smiled. It was a thing of white teeth and radiance, that smile. Sean had to return it, and they grinned at each other like 2 small boys in a successful bit of mischief. "If we push the oxen hard this day, we can reach Pretoria tonight, Nkosi." "Let us make the attempt," Sean encouraged him, and walked his horse down the slope to intercept the caravan. As it toiled slowly towards them through the flat white glare of the African morning, a commotion started at its rear and spread quickly along the line. The dogs clamoured, and the servants shouted encouragement to the rider, who raced past them towards the head of the caravan. He lay forward in the saddle, driving the pony with elbows and heels, hat hanging from the leather thong about his neck, and black hair ruffled with the speed of his run. "Oh, that cub roars louder than the lion that sired him," grunted Mbijani. But there was a fondness in his expression as he watched the rider reach the leading wagon and drag the pony from full run down onto its haunches. "Also, he spoils the mouth of every horse he rides." Sean's voice was as harsh as Mbijani's, but there was the same fond expression in his eyes as he watched his son cut loose the brown body of a springbok from the pommel of his saddle and let it drop into the road beside the wagon. 2 of the wagon drivers hurried to retrieve it, and Dirk Courtney kicked his pony and galloped down to where Sean and Mbijani waited beside the road. "Only one?" Sean asked as Dirk checked the pony and circled back to fall in beside him. "Oh, no, I got 3 with 3 shots. The gun boys are bringing the others." Off-handed, taking as natural that at 9 years of age he should be providing meat for the whole company, Dirk slouched down comfortably in the saddle, holding the reins in one hand and the other resting negligently on his hip in faithful imitation of his father. Scowling a little to cover the strength of his pride and his love, Sean examined him surreptitiously. The beauty of this boy's face was almost indecent. The innocence of the eyes and faultless skin should have belonged to a girl. The sun struck ruby sparks from the mass of dark curls. His eyes, spaced wide apart, were framed with long black lashes and overscored by the delicate lines of the brow. His eyes were emerald, and his skin was gold, and there were rubies in his hair, a face fashioned by a jewelsmith. Then Sean looked at the mouth and experienced a twinge of uneasiness. The mouth was too big, the lips too wide and soft. The shape of it was wrong, as though it were about to sulk or whine. "We're making a full day's trek today, Dirk. No outspun until we reach Pretoria. Ride back and tell the drivers."
"Send Imbijani. He's doing nothing."
"I told you to go."
"Hell, Dad, I've done enough today."
"Go, damn you!" Sean roared with unnecessary violence.
"I've only just come back. It's not fair that—"
Dirk started, but Sean did not let him finish. "Every time I ask you to do something, I get a mouthful of argument. Now you do what I tell you." They held each other's eyes, Sean glaring and Dirk resentful, sulky. Sean recognized that expression with dismay. This was going to be another of those tests of will that were becoming more frequent between them. Would this end as most of the others had? Must he admit defeat and use the sjambok again? When was the last time? 2 weeks ago, when Sean had reprimanded Dirk on some trivial point concerning the care of his pony. Dirk had stood sullenly until Sean was finished, and then he had walked away among the wagons. Dropping the subject from his mind, Sean was chatting with Imbijani when suddenly there was a squeal of pain from the laager, and Sean ran towards it. In the centre of the ring of wagons stood Dirk, his face still darkly flushed with temper, and at his feet the tiny body of one of the unweaned puppies flopped and whimpered, with its ribs stove in from Dirk's kick. In anger, Sean had beaten Dirk, but even in his anger he had used a length of rope and not the viciously tapered sjambok of hippo hide. Then he had ordered Dirk to his living wagon. At noon he had sent for him and demanded an apology, and Dirk, uncrying, with lips and jaw set grimly, had refused it. Sean beat him again with the rope, but this time coldly, not for the sake of retribution. Dirk did not break. Finally, in desperation, Sean took the sjambok to him. For 10 hissing strokes, each of which ended with a wicked snap across his buttocks, Dirk lay silently under the whip. His body convulsed slightly at each lash, but he would not speak, and Sean beat him with a sickness in his own stomach and the sweat of shame and guilt running into his eyes, swinging the sjambok mechanically with his fingers clawed around the butt of it and his mouth full of the slimy saliva of self-hatred. When at last Dirk screamed, Sean dropped the sjambok, reeled back against the side of the wagon, and leaned there gasping, fighting down the nausea which flooded, acid-tasting, up in his throat. Dirk screamed again and again, and Sean caught him up and held him to his chest. "I'm sorry, Pa! I'm sorry! I'll never do it again, I promise you! I love you best of all! I'll never do it again!" screamed Dirk, and they clung to each other. For days thereafter, not one of the servants had smiled at Sean nor spoken to him other than to acknowledge an order. For there was not one of them, including Imbijani, who would not steal and cheat and lie to ensure that Dirk Courtney had whatever he desired at the exact moment that he desired it. They could hate anyone, including Sean, who denied it to him. That was 2 weeks ago. And now, thought Sean, watching that ugly mouth, do we do it all again? Then suddenly Dirk smiled. It was one of those changes of mood that left Sean slightly bewildered, for when Dirk smiled, his mouth came right. It was irresistible. "I'll go, Dad." Cheerfully, as though he were volunteering, he prodded the pony and trotted back towards the wagons. "Cheeky little bugger," gruffed Sean for Imbijani's benefit, but silently he queried his share of the blame. He had raised the boy with a wagon as his home and the veldt as his schoolroom, grown men his companions, and authority over them as his undisputed right of birth. Since his mother had died 5 years before, he had not known the gentling influence of a woman. No wonder he was a wild one. Sean shied away from the memory of Dirk's mother. There was guilt there also, guilt that had taken him many years to reconcile. She was dead now, there was no profit in torturing himself. He pushed away the gloom that was swamping the happiness of a few minutes before, slapped the loose end of the reins against his horse's neck, and urged it out onto the road, south towards the low line of hills upon the horizon, south towards Pretoria. He's a wild one, but once we reach Ladysburg he'll be all right, Sean assured himself. They'll knock the nonsense out of him at school, and I'll knock some manners into him at home. No, he'll be all right. That evening, the 3rd of December 1899, Sean led his wagons down the hills and lagered them beside the Apis River. After they had eaten, Sean sent Dirk to his cot in the living wagon. Then he climbed alone to the crest of the hills and looked back across the land to the north. It was silver-grey in the moonlight, stretching away silent and immeasurable. That was the old life, and abruptly he turned his back upon it and walked down towards the lights of the city which beckoned to him from the valley below. Chapter 2. There had been a little unpleasantness when he had ordered Dirk to stay with the wagons. In consequence, Sean was in an evil mood as he crossed the bridge on the Apis and rode into the city the following morning. Beside him, Imbijani ran to keep pace with his horse. Deep in his own thoughts, Sean turned into Church Street before he noticed the unusual activity about him. A column of horsemen forced him to rein his horse to the side of the road. As they passed, Sean examined them with interest. Burghers in a motley of homespun and store clothes, riding in a formation which might imaginatively have been called a column of fours, but what excited Sean's curiosity was their numbers. By God, there must be 2,000 of them at least. From lads to greybeards, each of them was festooned with bandoliers of ammunition, and beside each left knee the butt of a bolt-action Mauser rifle stuck up from its scabbard. Blanket rolls tied to the saddles, canteens and cooking pots clattering, they filed past. There was no doubting it. This was a war commando. From the sidewalk, women and a few men called comment at them. "Geluk hoor, shoot straight, spoedige terugkomst." And the commandos laughed and shouted back. Sean stooped to a pretty girl who stood beside his horse. She was waving a red scarf, and suddenly Sean saw that though she smiled, her eyelashes were loaded with tears, like dew on a blade of grass. "Where are they going?" Sean raised his voice above the uproar. She lifted her head, and the movement loosed a tear. It dropped down her cheek, slid from her chin, and left a tiny damp spot on her blouse. "To the train, of course." "The train? Which train?" "Look, here comes the guns." In consternation, Sean looked up as the guns rumbled past. 2 of them. Uniformed gunners in blue, frogged with gold, sitting stiffly to attention on the carriages, the horses leaning forward against the immense weight of the guns. Tall wheels shod with steel, bronze glittering on the breeches in contrast to the sombre grey of the barrels. "My God," breathed Sean. Then, turning back to the girl, he grasped her shoulder and shook it in his agitation. "Where are they going? Tell me quickly, where?" "Mynheer!" She bridled at his touch and wriggled away from it. "Please, I'm sorry, you must tell me," Sean called after her as she disappeared into the crowd. A minute longer, Sean sat stupefied. Then his brain began to work again. It was war, then. But where? And against whom? Surely no tribal rising would call out this array of strength. Those guns were the most modern weapons Sean could conceive. Oh, no, this was a white man's war. Against the Orange Republic. Impossible, they were brothers. Against the British, then? The idea appalled him. And yet, 5 years ago there had been rumours. It had happened before. He remembered 1895 and the Jameson raid. Anything could have happened during the years he had been cut off from civilization. And now he had stumbled innocently into the midst of it. Quickly he considered his own position. He was British, born in Natal under the Union Jack. He looked like a burgher, spoke like one, rode like one. He was born in Africa, and he had never left it. But technically he was just as much an Englishman as if he had been born within the sound of Bow bells. Just supposing it was war between the Republic and Britain, and just supposing the Boers caught him, what would they do with him? Confiscate his wagons and his ivory, certainly. Throw him into prison, perhaps. Shoot him as a spy, possibly. "I've got to get the hell out of here," he mumbled. And then to Mbijani, "Come on, back to the wagons, quickly." Before they reached the bridge, he changed his mind. He had to learn with certainty what was happening. There was one person he could go to, and he must take the risk. "Mbijani, go back to the camp. Find Nkosazana Dirk and keep him there, even if you have to tie him. Speak to no man, and as you value your life, let Dirk speak with no man. It is understood?" "It is understood, Nkosi." And Sean, to all appearances another burgher among the thousands of burghers, worked his way slowly through the crowds and the press of wagons towards a general dealer's store at the top end of the town near the railway station. Since Sean had last seen it, the sign above the entrance had been freshly painted in red and gold. "I, Goldberg, importer and exporter, dealing in mining machinery, merchant and wholesaler, purchasing, agent, gold, precious stones, hides and skins, ivory and natural produce." Despite this war, or because of it, Mr. Goldberg's emporium was doing good business. It was crowded, and Sean drifted unnoticed among the customers, searching quietly for the proprietor. He found him selling a bag of coffee beans to a gentleman who was plainly sceptical of its quality. The discussion of the merits of Mr. Goldberg's coffee beans, as opposed to those of his competitor across the street, was becoming involved and technical. Sean leaned against a shelf full of merchandise, packed his pipe, lit it, and while he waited he watched Mr. Goldberg in action. The man should have been a barrister. His argument was strong enough to convince first Sean and finally the customer. The latter paid, slung the bag over his shoulder and grumbled his way out of the shop, leaving Mr. Goldberg glowing pink and perspiring in the flush of achievement. "You haven't lost any weight, Izzy?" Sean greeted him. Goldberg peered at him uncertainly over his gold-framed spectacles, beginning to smile until suddenly he recognized Sean. He blinked with shock, jerked his head in a gesture of invitation. So his jowls wobbled and disappeared into the back office. Sean followed him. "Are you mad, Mr. Courtney?" Goldberg was waiting for him, quivering with agitation. "If they catch you—" "Listen, Izzy, I arrived last night. I haven't spoken to a white man in 4 years. What the hell is going on here?" "You haven't heard?" "No, damn it, I haven't." "It's war, Mr. Courtney." "I can see that, but where? Against whom?" "On all the borders. Natal, the Cape." "Against?" "The British Empire." Goldberg shook his head as though he did not believe his own statement. "We have taken on the whole British Empire." "We?" Sean asked sharply. "The Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State. Already we have won great victories. Ladysmith is besieged, Kimberley, Mafeking." "You, personally?" "I was born here in Pretoria. I am a burgher." "Are you going to turn me in?" No, of course not. You have been a good customer of mine for years." "Thanks, Izzy. Look, I've got to get out of here as fast as I can." "It would be wise." "What about my money at the Volkskas? Can I get it out?" Izzy shook his head sadly. "They've frozen all enemy accounts." "Damn it! God damn it!" Sean swore bitterly. And then, "Izzy, I've got 20 wagons and 10 tons of ivory parked out there on the edge of town. Are you interested?" "How much?" 10,000 for the lot. Oxen, wagons, ivory, the lot." "It would not be patriotic, Mr. Courtney," Goldberg decided reluctantly. "Trading with the enemy. Besides, I have only your word that it's 10 tons. "Hell, Izzy, I'm not the British Army. That lot is worth 20,000 quid. "You want me to buy sight unseen, no questions asked? All right, I give you 4,000, gold." 7. 4.5, counted Izzy. "You bastard! 4.5. "No, damn you, 5, growled Sean. 5? 5. All right, 5. "Thanks, Izzy. Pleasure, Mr. Courtney." Sean described the location of his lager hurriedly. "You can send someone out to pick it up. I'm going to run for the Natal border as soon as it's dark. Keep off the roads and well clear the railway. Joubert has 30,000 men in northern Natal massed around Ladysmith and along the Tugela Heights. Goldberg went to the safe and fetched 5 small canvas bags from it. Do you want to check? I'll trust you as you trusted me. Goodbye, Izzy. Sean dropped the heavy bags down the front of his shirt and settled them under his belt. Good luck, Mr. Courtney. Chapter 3. There were 2 hours of daylight left when Sean finished paying his servants. He pushed the tiny pile of sovereigns across the tailboard of the wagon towards the last man, and went with him through the complicated ritual of farewell, the hand-clapping and the clasping, the repetition of the formal phrases. Then he stood up from his chair and looked around the circle. They squatted patiently, watching him with wooden black faces, but reflected back from them he could sense his own sorrow at this parting. Men with whom he had lived and worked and shared 100 hardships. It was not easy to leave them now. "It is finished," he said. "Yeah, boy, it is finished," they agreed in chorus, and no one moved. "Go, damn you!" Slowly one of them stood and gathered the bundle of his possessions. A kaross, or skin blanket, 2 spears, a cast-off shirt that Sean had given him. He balanced the bundle on his head and looked at Sean. "Ngozi," he said, and lifted a clenched fist in salute. "Nonga," Sean replied. The man turned away and trudged out of the laager. "Ngozi, Chlubi, Ngozi, Zama." A roll call of loyalty. Sean spoke their names for the last time, and singly they left the laager. Sean stood and watched them walk away in the dusk. Not one of them looked back, and no 2 men walked together. It was finished. Wearily Sean turned back to the laager. The horses were ready, 3 with saddles, 2 carrying packs. "We'll eat first, Mbijani." "It is ready, Nkosi. Chlubi cooked before he went." "Come on, Dirk, dinner." Dirk was the only one who spoke during the meal. He chattered gaily, wrought up with excitement by this new adventure, while Sean and Mbijani shovelled fat Chlubi's stew and hardly tasted it. Out in the gathering darkness a jackal yelped, a lonely sound on the evening wind, fitting the mood of a man who had lost friends and fortune. "It is time," Sean shrugged into his sheepskin jacket and buttoned it as he stood to kick out the fire. But suddenly he froze and stood with his head cocked as he listened. There was a new sound on the wind. "Horses," Mbijani confirmed it. "Quickly, Mbijani, my rifle." The Zulu leapt up, ran to the horses, and slipped Sean's rifle from its scabbard. "Get out of the light and keep your mouth shut," Sean ordered as he hustled Dirk into the shadows between the wagons. He grabbed the rifle from Mbijani and levered a cartridge into the breech, and the 3 of them crouched and waited. The click and roll of pebbles under hooves, the soft sound of a branch brushed aside. "Only one," whispered Mbijani. A pack-horse whickered softly and was answered immediately from the darkness. Then silence. A long silence, broken at last by the jingle of a bridle as the rider dismounted. Sean saw him then, a slim figure emerging slowly out of the night, and he swung the rifle to cover his approach. There was something unusual in the way the stranger moved, gracefully, but with a sway from the hips, long-legged like a colt, and Sean knew that he was young, very young, to judge by his height. With relief, Sean straightened up from his crouch and examined him as he stopped uncertainly beside the fire and peered into the shadows. The lad wore a peaked cloth cap pulled down over his ears, and his jacket was an expensive honey-coloured chamois. His riding breeches were beautifully tailored and hugged his buttocks snugly. Sean decided that his backside was too big and out of proportion to the small feet clad in polished English hunting boots. A regular dandy, and the scorn was in Sean's tone as he called out, "Stay where you are, friend, and state your business." The effect of Sean's challenge was unexpected. The lad jumped. The soles of his glossy boots cleared the ground by at least 6 inches, and when he landed again he was facing Sean. "Talk up, I haven't got all night." The lad opened his mouth, closed it again, licked his lips and spoke. "I was told you were going to Natal." The voice was low and husky. "Who told you that?" demanded Sean.
My uncle."
"Who's your uncle?"
"Isaac Goldberg."
Sean digested this intelligence, and while he did so he examined the face before him. Clean-shaven, pale, big dark eyes, and a laughing kind of mouth that was now pursed with fright. "And if I am?" Sean demanded.
"I want to go with you."
"Forget it. Get back on your horse and go home."
"I'll pay you. I'll pay you well."
Was it the voice or the posture of the lad? Sean pondered. There was something very odd about him. He stood with a flat leather pouch held in both hands across the front of his hips, in an attitude of defence, as though he was protecting... Protecting what? And suddenly Sean knew what it was. "Take off your cap," he ordered.
"No, take it off."
A second longer the lad hesitated. Then, in a gesture that was almost defiance, he jerked off the cap, and two thick black braids of hair, shiny in the firelight, dropped and hung down almost to his waist, and transformed him instantly from gawky masculinity into stunning womanhood. Although he had guessed it, Sean was unprepared for the shock of this revelation. It was not so much her beauty, but her attire that caused the shock. Never in his life had Sean seen a woman in breeches, and now he gasped. Breeches, by God! She might as well be naked from the waist down. Even that would be less indecent. £200. She was coming towards him now, offering the pouch. At each step the cloth of the breeches tightened across her thighs, and Sean dragged his eyes guiltily back to her face. "Keep your money, lady." Her eyes were grey, smoky grey. "200 on account, and as much again when we reach Natal." "I'm not interested." But he was. Those soft lips starting to quiver. "How much, then? Name your price." "Look, lady, I'm not heading a procession. There are 3 of us already, 1 a child. There's hard riding ahead, plenty of it, and an army of boors in between. Our chances are slim enough as it is. Another member to the party, and a woman at that, will make them prohibitive. I don't want your money. All I want is to get my son to safety. Go home and sit this war out. It won't last long." "I am going to Natal." "Good. You go then, but not with us." Sean could not trust himself longer to resist the appeal of those grey eyes, and he turned to Mbijani. "Horses," he snapped, and walked away from her. She stood watching him quietly as they mounted up, making no protest. She seemed very small and alone as Sean looked down at her from the saddle. "I'm sorry," he growled. "Go home now like a good girl." And quickly he wheeled away and trotted out into the night. All night they rode, east through the open moonlit land. Once they passed a darkened homestead, and a dog barked. But they sheered away and then turned east again, and held the great crucifix of the Southern Cross at their right hand. When Dirk fell asleep in the saddle and slipped sideways, Sean caught him before he hit the ground, pulled him across into his lap, and held him there for the rest of the night. Before dawn they found a clump of bush on the bank of a stream, hobbled the horses and made camp. Mbijani had the billy can boiling over a small well-screened fire, and Sean had rolled Dirk unconscious into his blankets when the girl rode into camp and jumped down from her horse. "I nearly lost you twice," she laughed and pulled off the cap. "Gave me a horrible fright." She shook down the shiny braids. "Coffee! Oh, good! I'm famished." Menacingly, Sean climbed to his feet, and with clenched fists he glared at her. But undismayed she hobbled her horse and turned it loose before acknowledging him again. "Oh, don't stand on ceremony, please be seated." And she grinned at him with such devilment in her grey eyes, aping so faithfully his stance with hands on those indecent hips, that Sean suddenly found himself smiling. He tried to stop it, for he knew it was an admission of surrender, but his effort was so unsuccessful that she burst into delighted laughter. "How's your cooking?" he demanded. "So. You'd better brush up on it, because from now on you're working your passage." Later, when he had sampled it for the first time, he admitted grudgingly, "Not bad in the circumstances," and wiped the plate with a crust of bread. "You are too kind, sir." She thanked him, and lugged her blanket roll into the shade, spread it, pulled off her boots, wriggled her toes, and lay back with a sigh. Sean positioned his own bedroll with care, so that when he opened his eyes without turning his head, he could watch her from under the brim of the hat that covered his face. He woke at midday and saw that she slept with one cheek in her open hand, the lashes of her eyes meshed together, and a few loose strands of dark hair across a face that was damp and flushed in the drowsy heat. He watched her for a long time before silently rising and crossing to his saddlebags. When he went down to the stream, he took with him his flat canvas toilet bag, the remaining pair of breeches that were neither patched nor too badly stained, and a clean silk shirt. Sitting on a rock beside the water, naked and freshly scrubbed, he regarded his face in the polished steel mirror. A big job. He sighed and started snipping at the great bush of beard, which had not felt the scissors in 3 years. At dusk, self-conscious as a girl in her first party dress, Sean walked back into the camp. They were all awake. Dirk and the girl sat together on her blanket in such earnest conversation that neither of them noticed his arrival. Mbijani was busy at the fire. He rocked back on his heels and examined Sean without change of expression. "We had better eat and get going." Dirk and the girl looked up. Her eyes narrowed and then widened thoughtfully. Dirk gaped at him, and then, "Your beard's all funny," he announced, and the girl tried desperately to quell her laughter. "Get your blankets rolled up, boy." Sean tried to break Dirk's grip on the subject, but like a bulldog, Dirk held on relentlessly. "And why are you wearing your best clothes, Dad?" Chapter 4. They rode 3 abreast in the darkness, Dirk between them, and Mbijani trailing behind with the pack-horses. The land rose and fell beneath them like the swells of an endless sea, and the way in which the grass moved with the night wind heightened the illusion of waves. Islands in the sea were the dark bulks of the kopjes they passed, and the yelp of a jackal was the voice of a seabird. "Aren't we holding too far east?" The girl broke the silence, and her voice blended with the soft sound of the wind. "Intentionally," Sean answered. "I want to cross the tail of the Drakensberg, well clear of the Boer concentrations around Ladysmith and the line of rail," and he looked over Dirk's head at her. She rode with her face lifted to the sky. "You know the stars?" he asked. "A little. So do I. I know them all." Dirk accepted the challenge and swivelled towards the south. "That's the cross with the pointers, and that's Orion with his sword on his belt, and that's the Milky Way." "Tell me some others," the girl invited. "Oh, the others are just ordinary ones. They don't count. They haven't got any names." "Oh, but they have. And most of them have got a story." There was a pause. Dirk was now in an invidious position. Either he had to admit ignorance, and Dirk's pride was too large to swallow with ease, or else he would forego what promised to be a choice series of stories. Large as was his pride, his appetite for stories was even larger. "Tell me some," he conceded. "You see that little clump there underneath the big bright one? They are called the 7 Sisters. Well, once upon a time—" Within minutes Dirk was completely absorbed. These were even better than Mbijani's stories, probably because they were new, while Dirk could recite from memory Mbijani's entire repertoire. He fell upon any weakness in the plot like a prosecuting attorney. "But why didn't they just shoot the old witch?" "Well, they didn't have guns in those days." "They could have used a bow and arrow." "You can't kill a witch with a bow and arrow. The arrow just goes straight through her, without hurting her." "Hang's teeth." That was really impressive. But before accepting it, Dirk found it necessary to corroborate with expert opinion. He checked with Mbijani, translating the problem into Zulu. When Mbijani supported the girl, Dirk was convinced, for Mbijani was a celebrated authority on the supernatural. That night Dirk did not fall asleep in the saddle, and when they camped before dawn, the girl's voice was hoarse with overwork. But her conquest of Dirk was complete, and that of Sean was well advanced. All night, while he listened to her voice, and the husky bursts of laughter that punctuated it, Sean had felt the seed that was planted at their first meeting sinking its roots down into his lower belly and loins, spreading its tendrils up through his chest. He wanted this woman so violently that in her presence his wits failed him. Many times during the night he had attempted to join the discussions, but each time Dirk had brushed his efforts aside with contempt and turned avidly back to the girl. By morning he had made the disturbing discovery that he was jealous of his own son, jealous of the attention Dirk was getting, and for which he hungered so strongly. While they drank coffee after the morning meal lying on their blankets beneath a grove of syringa trees, Sean remarked, "You haven't told us your name yet." And of course it was Dirk that answered. "She told me. Your name's Ruth, isn't it?" "That's right, Dirk." With an effort, Sean clamped down on the senseless anger that boiled up through him. But when he spoke, his voice carried traces of it. "We've heard enough from you for one night, my boy. Now get your head down, close your eyes and your mouth, and keep them that way."
"I'm not sleepy, Dad."
"Do what I tell you." Sean jumped up and strode out of the camp. He climbed the small koppie above them. By now it was full daylight, and he searched the veldt to the horizon on all sides. There was no trace of habitation, or human. He climbed down again and fussed with the hobbles of the horses before returning to the grove of syringas. Despite his protestations, Dirk was curled like a sleeping puppy, and near the fire from a large bundle of blankets issued the unmistakable snoring of Mbijani. Ruth lay a little apart from them, a blanket thrown over her legs, her eyes closed, and the front of her shirt rising and falling, in a manner that gave Sean 2 good reasons for not sleeping. He lay propped on one elbow, and fed his eyes and his imagination on her. These 4 years past, he had not seen a white woman. 4 years without the sound of a woman's voice or the comfort of her body. In the beginning it had worried him, the restlessness, the undirected fits of depression, and sudden bursts of temper. But gradually, in the long days of hunting and riding, in the endless struggle with drought and storm, with beasts and the elements, he had brought his body under control. Women had faded into unreality, vague phantoms that plagued him only in the night, so that he twisted and sweated and cried out in his sleep, until nature gave him release, and the phantoms dispersed for a while, to gather strength for their next visitation. But this was no phantom that lay beside him now. By stretching out a hand, he could stroke the faint down on her cheek, and feel the blood-warm silk of her skin. She opened her eyes. They were milky grey with sleep, slowly focusing until they levelled with his, and returned his scrutiny. Because of what she read there, she lifted her left hand from the blanket and held it out towards him. Her riding gloves were off. For the first time he noticed the slender gold ring that encircled her third finger. "I see," he muttered dully. And then in protest, "But you are too young. You're too young to be married." "I'm 22 years old," she told him softly. "Your husband, where is he?" Perhaps the bastard was dead, his one last hope. "I'm going to him now. When war seemed inevitable, he went to Natal, to Durban, to find a job and a home for us there. I was to follow him, but the war came earlier than we expected. I was stranded." "I see." "I'm taking you to another man," he thought with bitterness, and put it in different words. "So he's sitting in Durban waiting for you to make your own way through the lines?" "He's with the army of Natal. A week ago he got a message through to me. He wanted me to stay on in Johannesburg and wait until the British capture of the city. He says that with so great a force they'll be in Johannesburg within 3 months. "Why didn't you wait then?" She shrugged. "Patience is not one of my virtues." And then the devilment was in her eyes again. "Besides, I thought it would be fun to run away. It was so terribly dull in Johannesburg." "Do you love him?" he demanded suddenly. The question startled her, and the smile died on her lips. "He's my husband." "Well, that doesn't answer my question." "It was a question you had no right to ask." She was angry now. "You have to tell me." "Do you love your wife?" she snapped at him. "I did. She's been dead 5 years." and her anger flickered out as swiftly as it had blazed. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know." Forget it. Forget I ever asked." "Yes, that's best." "We're getting into an awful tangle." Her hand with the ring upon it was still held out towards him, lying between them on the soft carpet of fallen leaves. He reached out and lifted it. It was a small hand. "Mr. Courtney, Sean, it's best if... we mustn't... I think we'd better sleep now." And she withdrew the hand and rolled away from him. The wind woke them in the middle of the afternoon. It roared in from the east, flattening the grass on the hills and thrashing the branches above their heads. Sean looked up at the sky with the wind fluttering his shirt and ruffling his beard. He leaned forward against it, towering over Ruth, so that suddenly she realized how big he was. He looked like a god of the storm, with long, powerful legs braced apart, and the muscles of his chest and arms standing out proudly beneath the white silk of his shirt. "Clouds building up," Sean shouted above the rush of the wind. "No moon tonight." She stood up quickly, and a sudden violent gust threw her off balance. She staggered against him, and his arms closed about her. For a moment she was pressed to his chest, could feel the lean, rubbery resilience of his body, and smell the man smell of it. It was a shock for both of them, this unexpectedly intimate contact, and when she broke away her eyes were wide and grey with fear of the thing she had felt stir within her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "That was an accident." And the wind caught her hair and streamed it across her face in a dancing, snapping black tangle. "We'll up-saddle and ride with the daylight that's left," Sean decided. "We won't be able to move tonight." The clouds rolled in on the wind, spreading upon themselves, changing shape and dropping closer to the earth. Clouds the colour of smoke and bruises, heavy with the rain they carried. The night came early, but still the wind roared and buffeted them in the gloom. "It'll drop in an hour or so, then we'll get the rain. We'll try and find shelter while there's still light enough to see." On the reverse slope of a kopje, they found an overhang of rock and offloaded the packs beneath it, while Sean pegged the horses out on their head ropes to prevent them walking away before the storm. Mbijani cut grass and piled it into a mattress on the rock floor beneath the overhang. Huddled in their oilskins, they ate biltong and cold mealie bread, and afterwards Mbijani withdrew discreetly to the far end of the shelter and disappeared under his blankets. He had that animal knack of being able to sleep instantly and completely, even under the most adverse conditions. "All right, boy, get into your blankets." "Can't I just—" Dirk began his nightly protest. "No, you can't." "I'll sing for you," Ruth offered. "What for?" Dirk was puzzled. "A sleepy-time song? Haven't you ever had a lullaby?" "No," but Dirk was intrigued. "What you going to sing?" "Into your blankets first." Sitting beside Sean in the darkness, very conscious of his bulk and the touch of his shoulder against hers, the muted roar of the wind as her accompaniment, Ruth sang. First the old Dutch folk songs, Noi Noi and Jannie met die Hoepelbeen, then other old favourites like Frère Jacques. Her voice meant something to each of them. Mbijani woke to the sound of it, and it made him remember the wind on the hills of Zululand and the singing of the young girls in the fields at harvest time. It made him glad he was going home. To Dirk, it was the voice of the mother he hardly known. A safe sound, and soon he slept. "Don't stop," whispered Sean. So she sang for him alone. A love song from 2,000 years ago, filled with all the suffering of her people, but with joy in it also. The wind died away while she sang, and her voice died away with it into the vast silence of the night. The storm broke. The first thunder crashed, and the lightning forked jagged blue through the clouds. Dirk whimpered a little, but slept on. In the stark blue light, Sean saw that Ruth's cheeks were wet with tears, and when the darkness closed around them again, she started to tremble against him. He reached out for her, and she clung to him, small and warm against his chest, and he could taste the salt of her tears on his lips. Sean, we mustn't." But he lifted her and held her across his chest as he walked out into the night. The lightning blazed again and lit the land with startling brilliance, so he could see the horses huddling heads down and the crisp outline of the kopje above them. The first raindrops splashed against his shoulders and into his face. The rain was warm, and he walked on, carrying Ruth. Then the air was filled with rain, an encompassing pearly mist of it in the next flash of lightning, and the night was filled with the odour of rain on dry earth. A clean, warm smell. Chapter 5. In a still morning, washed so clean by the rain that they could see the mountains blue and sharp on the southern horizon, they stood together on the crest of the kopje. "That's the tail of the Drakensberg. We've cleared it by 20 miles. There's very little chance of a Boer patrol this far out. We can ride by day now. Soon we'll be able to work in again and meet the railway beyond the battle lines." Because of the beauty of the morning, of the land that dripped away into the great grassy bowl that was Natal, and of the woman that stood beside him, Sean was gay. Because of the promise of an end to the journey and the promise of a new one with this woman as his companion, he was content. When he spoke, she turned slowly to look up at him, her chin lifting in acknowledgment of his superior height. For the first time, Sean realized that his own mood was not reflected in her eyes. "You're very lovely," he said, and still she remained silent. But now he could recognize the shadows in her eyes as sorrow, or something even stronger. "Ruth, you'll come with me?" "No." She shook her head slowly, regretfully. The fat black python of hair rolled across her shoulder and hung down against the honey chamois leather of her jacket. "You must." "I cannot." "But last night was madness. The storm." "It was right. You know that." "No, it was the storm." She looked away from him towards the sky. "And now the storm is ended." "It was more than that, you know it. It was from the first moment of our meeting." "It was a madness based upon deceit, something that I'll have to cover with lies, the way we had to cover it with darkness at the time." "Oh, Ruth, my God, don't talk about it like that." "Very well, I won't. I won't talk about it again, ever." "We can't leave it now. You know we can't." And in answer, she held up her left hand so that the gold upon it caught the sun. "We'll say goodbye here on a mountain in the sunlight, though we'll ride together a little further. It's here we'll say goodbye." "Ruth," he started. But she placed the hand across his mouth, and he felt the metal of the ring on his lips, and it seemed to him that the ring was as cold as his dread of the loss she was about to inflict upon him. "No," she whispered. "Kiss me once more, and then let me go. Let me go." Chapter 6. Mbijani saw it first, and spoke quietly to Sean, perhaps 2 miles out on their flank, like a smudge of brown smoke rising beyond the fold of the nearest ridge, so faint that Sean had to search a moment before he found it. Then he swivelled away from it and hunted frantically for cover. The nearest was an outcrop of red stone 1/2 mile away, much too far. "What is it, Sean?" Ruth noticed his agitation. "Dust," he told her. "Horsemen coming this way." "Boers?" "Probably."
What are we to do?"
"Nothing."
"Nothing?"
"When they show on the ridge, I'll ride to meet them. Try to bluff our way through." He turned to Mbijani and spoke in Zulu. "I will go to them. Watch me carefully, but keep moving away. If I lift my arm, let the pack horses go and ride. I will hold them as long as I can, but when I lift my arm, then it is finished." Quickly he unbuckled the saddle-bag, which held the gold, and handed it to the Zulu. "With a good start, you should be able to hold them off until nightfall. Take the Nkosikazi where she wishes to go, and then with Dirk return to my mother at Ladyburg." He looked again at the ridge, just in time to see 2 horsemen appear upon it. Sean lifted the binoculars from his chest. In the round field of the glasses, the 2 riders stood broadside, their faces turned towards him, so he could make out the shape of their helmets. He saw the burnished sparkle of their accoutrements, the size of their mounts and their distinctive saddlery, and he yelled with relief, "Soldiers!" As if in confirmation, a squadron of cavalry in 2 neat ranks broke over the skyline with the pennants fluttering gaily on the forest of their lances. Dirk hooting with excitement, Ruth laughing beside him, and Imbijani dragging the pack-horses after them, Sean galloped, standing in the stirrups and waving his hat above his head to meet them. Unaffected by the enthusiasm of the welcome, the lancers sat stolidly and watched them come, and the subaltern at the head greeted Sean suspiciously as he arrived. "Who are you, sir?" But he seemed less interested in Sean's reply than in Ruth's breeches and what they contained. During the explanations that followed, Sean conceived for the man a growing dislike, although the smooth, sun-reddened skin and the fluffy yellow moustache aggravated this feeling. The central cause was the pair of pale blue eyes. Perhaps they always popped out that way, but Sean doubted it. They focused steadily on Sean only during the short period when Sean reported that he had made no contact with the Boer. Then they swivelled back to Ruth. "We'll not detain you longer, Lieutenant," Sean grunted, and gathered his reins to turn away. "You are still 10 miles from the Tugela River, Mr. Courtney. Theoretically, this area is held by the Boers, and although we are well out on the flank of their main army, it would be much safer if you entered the British lines under our protection." "Thank you, no. I want to avoid both armies and reach Pietermaritzburg as soon as possible." The subaltern shrugged. "The choice is yours. But if it were my wife and child—" He did not finish, but turned in the saddle to signal the column forward. "Come on, Ruth." Sean caught her eye, but she did not move. "I'm not going with you." There was a flat quality in her voice, and she looked away from him. "Don't be silly." It shocked him, and gave his reply a harshness that lit sparks of anger in her eyes. "May I travel with you?" she demanded of the subaltern. "Well, ma'am," he hesitated, glancing quickly at Sean, before he went on. If your husband—" "He's not my husband. I hardly know him," she cut in, and ignored the exclamation of protest from Sean. "My husband is with your army. I want you to take me with you, please." "Well, now, that's the horse of another colour," the officer drawled, but the lazy arrogance of his tone barely concealed his pleasure at the prospect of Ruth's company. "I'd be delighted to escort you, ma'am." With her knees, Ruth backed her mount and fell in beside the subaltern. The small manoeuvre placed her directly facing Sean, as though she were on the far side of a barrier. "Ruth, please, please, let me talk to you about this. Just a few minutes." "No." There was no expression in her voice, nor in her face. "Just to say goodbye," he pleaded. "We've said goodbye." She glanced from Sean to Dirk, and then away. The subaltern raised his clenched fist high and lifted his voice. "Column! Column! Forward!" And as his big glossy hunter started, he grinned maliciously at Sean and touched the brim of his helmet in ironical salute. "Ruth!" But she was no longer looking at Sean. Her eyes were fixed ahead, and as she swept away at the head of the column, her chin was up. That smiling type of mouth was drawn into 2 straight lips, and the thick braid of hair thumped against her back with each thrust of the horse beneath her. "Rough luck, matey," called a trooper from the rear rank, and then they were past. Hunched in the saddle, Sean started after them. "Is she coming back, Pa?" Dirk inquired. "No, she's not coming back." "Why not?" Sean did not hear the question. He was watching, waiting for Ruth to look back at him. But he waited in vain. For suddenly she was gone over and beyond the next fold in the land, and a few seconds later the column had followed her. Afterwards there was only the vast emptiness of the land and the sky above, as vast as the emptiness within him. Chapter 7. Sean rode ahead. 10 yards behind they followed, Imbijani restraining Dirk from a closer approach, for he understood that Sean must now be left alone. Many times in the years they had been together, Imbijani and Sean had travelled in this formation, Sean riding ahead with his sorrow or his shame, and Mbijani trailing him patiently, waiting for Sean's shoulders to straighten and his chin to lift from where it drooped forward on his chest. There was no coherence in Sean's thoughts. The only pattern was the rise and swoop of alternate anger and despair. Anger at the woman, anger almost becoming hatred, before the plunge of despair as he remembered she was gone. Then anger building up towards madness, this time directed at himself for letting her go. Again the sickening drop, as he realized that there was no means by which he could have held her. What could he have offered her? Himself? 200 pounds of muscle and bones and scars, supporting a face like a granite cliff? Poor value. His worldly goods? A small sack of sovereigns, and another woman's child. By God, that was all he had. After 37 years, that was all he had to show. Once more his anger flared. A week ago he had been rich, and his anger found a new target. There was at least somewhere he could seek vengeance. There was a tangible enemy to strike, to kill. The Boer. The Boer had robbed him of his wagons and his gold, had sent him scurrying for safety. Because of them the woman had come into his life, and because of them she had been snatched away from him. So be it, he thought angrily. This, then, is the promise of the future. War. He straightened in the saddle. His shoulders seemed to fill out wide and square. He lifted his head and saw the shiny snake of a river in the valley below. They had reached the Tugela. Without pause, Sean pushed his horse over the lip of the escarpment. On its haunches, loose rock rolling and slithering beneath its hooves, they began the descent. Impatiently, Sean followed the river downstream, searching for a drift. But between the sheer banks it ran smooth and swift and deep, 20 yards wide and still discoloured with mud from the storm. At the first place where the far bank flattened sufficiently to promise an easy exit from the water, Sean checked his horse and spoke brusquely. "We'll swim." In reply, Mbijani glanced significantly at Dirk. "He's done this before," Sean answered him as he dismounted, and began to shed his clothing. Then to the boy. "Come on, Dirk, get undressed." They drove the pack horses in first, forcing them to jump from the steep bank, and watched anxiously until their heads reappeared above the surface, and they struck out for the far bank. Then all three of them, naked, their clothing wrapped in oilskins, and lashed to the saddles, they remounted. "You first, Mbijani." A splash that rose above the bank. "Off you go, Dirk. Remember to hang on to the saddle." Another high splash, and Sean flogged his mount as it balked and danced sideways along the bank. A sudden lunge outwards, and the long drop before the water closed over them. Snorting water, they surfaced, and with relief Sean saw Dirk's head bobbing beside that of his horse, and heard his shouted excitement. Moments later they stood on the far bank, water streaming from their naked bodies, and laughed together at the fun of it. Abruptly the laughter was strangled to death in Sean's throat. Lining the bank above them, grinning with the infection of merriment, but with Mauser rifles held ready, stood a dozen men. Big men, bearded, festooned with bandoliers of ammunition, dressed in rough clothing and a selection of hats that included a brown derby and a tall beaver. In imitation of Sean, both Mbijani and Dirk stopped laughing and stared up at the frieze of armed men along the bank. A complete silence fell on the gathering. It was broken at last by the man in the brown derby, as he pointed at Sean with the barrel of his Mauser. "Machtig, but you'd need a sharp axe to cut through that branch." "Don't anger him," warned the gentleman in the beaver. "If he hits you over the head with it, it will crack your skull." And they all laughed. It was hard for Sean to decide which was the more discomforting, the intimate discussion of his nudity, or the fact that the discussion was conducted in the Taal, or Cape Dutch. In his impatience he had walked, or rather swum, into the arms of a Boer patrol. There was just a forlorn hope that he might be able to bluff his way through, and he opened his mouth to make the attempt, but Dirk forestalled him. "Who are they, Pa, and why are they laughing?" he asked in clear, piping English. And Sean's hope died as abruptly as did the Boer laughter when they heard that hated language. "Ah, sir," growled the man in the beaver, and gestured eloquently with his Mauser. Hands up, please, my friend. Will you allow me to put my trousers on first? Sean asked politely.
Where are they taking us?
For once Dirk was subdued, and there was a quiver in his voice that touched Beaver, who rode beside him. He answered for Sean. Now, don't you worry. You're going to see a general. A real live general. Beaver's English was intelligible, and Dirk studied him with interest.
Will he have medals and things?
Ach, nee, man. We don't use such rubbish. And Dirk lost interest. He turned back to Sean.
Pa, I'm hungry.
Again Beaver intervened. He pulled a long black stick of biltong, dried meat, from his pocket, and offered it to Dirk. Sharpen your teeth on that, Kerel. With his mouth full, Dirk was taken care of, and Sean could concentrate on the other Boers. They were convinced they had caught a spy, and were discussing the impending execution. In a friendly manner, Sean was admitted to the argument, and they listened with respectful attention to his defence. This was interrupted while they forded the Tugela and climbed the escarpment once more, but Sean continued it while they rode in a bunch along the crest. Finally he convinced them of his innocence, which they accepted with relief, as none of them were really looking forward to shooting him. Thereafter the talk turned to more pleasant topics. It was a glorious day. Sunshine lit the valley in gold and green. Below them the river twisted and sparkled, working its devious way down from the smoky blue wall of the Drakensberg that stood along the far horizon. A few fat clouds dawdled across the sky, and a light breeze took the edge off the heat. The youngsters in the party listened avidly as Sean spoke of the elephant beyond the Limpopo, and of the wide land that waited for men to claim it. "After the war," they said, and laughed in the sun. Then a change in the wind, and a freak lie of the hills brought a faint but ugly sound down to them, and the laughter died. "The guns," said one of them. "Ladysmith." Now it was Sean's turn to ask the questions. They told him how the commandos had raced down to the town of Ladysmith and rolled up the force that stood to oppose them. Bitterly they remembered how old Joubert had held his horsemen and watched while the broken English army streamed back into the town. "Almighty, had he loosed us on them then, we would sweep them into the sea. If Oom Paul had commanded instead of old Joubert, the war would be finished already. But instead we sit and wait." Gradually Sean filled in the picture of the war in Natal. Ladysmith was invested. General George White's army was bottled and corked within the town. Half the Boer army had moved forward along the railway and taken up a defensive line straddling the escarpment, overlooking the river and the tiny village of Colenso. Below them, on the great plain of the Tugela, General Buller was massing his army for the breakthrough to relieve Ladysmith. "But let him try. Oom Paul is waiting for him." "Who is Oom Paul? Surely not Kruger?" Sean was puzzled. Oom Paul was the affectionate nickname of the President of the South African Republic. "Ach nee, man. This is another Oom Paul. This one is Vecht-General Jan Paulus Leroux of the Wynberg Commando." And Sean caught his breath. "Is he a big man with red hair and a temper to go with it?" Laughter, and then, "Ja, yeah, that's the one. Do you know him?" "Yes, yes, I know him. "So, my brother-in-law is now a general," Sean grinned to himself, and then asked, "Is this the general we are going to visit?" "If we can find him, ja." Young Dirk will meet his uncle at last. And Sean found himself anticipating the reunion with a tingle of pleasure. Chapter 8. The canvas of the tent did little to moderate the volume of the voice within. It carried clearly to where Sean waited with his escort. "Must I drink coffee and shake hands with every Royneck we catch? Have I not already enough work for 10 men, but you must bring me more? Send him to one of the field cornets. Send him to Pretoria and let them lock him up. Do whatever you like with him if he's a spy, but in the name of merciful Providence, don't bring him to me." Sean smiled happily. Jan Paulus certainly hadn't lost his voice. There was an interval of comparative quiet while Beaver's voice mumbled within the tent. Then again the muted bellow. "No, I will not. Take him away." Sean filled his lungs. cupped his hands about his mouth and shouted at the tent, "Hey, you bloody Dutchman, are you afraid to meet me again? You think I'll knock your teeth out like I did the last time?" A few moments of appalling stillness, then the clattering of an overturned stool, and the flap of the tent was thrown open. Into the sunlight, blinking in the glare but scowling, the red hair that fringed his bald pate burning like a bushfire, and his shoulders hunched aggressively, came Jan Paulus. His face turned from side to side as he searched for the source of the insult. "Here!" called Sean, and Jan Paulus stopped dead. Uncertainly he peered at Sean. "You!" He took a pace forward, and then, "It is you, isn't it? Sean! Ha!" And he began to laugh. His right hand, that had been clenched into a huge fist, unfolded and was thrust forward. "Sean, hell, man! Sean!" They gripped hands and grinned at each other. "Come into the tent, man! Come on in, come on in!" Once they were inside, Jan Paulus's first question was, "Where's Katrina? Where's my little sister?" And immediately the smile was gone from Sean's face. He sat down heavily on the rimpi stool and took off his hat before he answered. "She's dead, Paulus. She's been dead these last 4 years." Slowly the expression on Jan Paulus's face changed, until it was bleak and hard. "How?" he asked. And what can I answer him, thought Sean. Can I tell him she killed herself for some reason that no one will ever know? "Fever," he said. "Blackwater fever." "You did not send word to us?" "I did not know where to find you." "Your parents, they too are dead," Jan Paulus interrupted brusquely, and turned away from Sean to stare at the white canvas wall of the tent. There was silence between them then, as they remembered the dead in sorrow, made more poignant by its utter helplessness. At last Sean stood up and went to the entrance of the tent. "Dirk, come here." Mbijani pushed him forward, and he crossed to Sean and took his hand. Sean led him into the tent. "Katrina's son," he said, and Jan Paulus looked down at him. "Come here, boy." Hesitantly, Dirk went to him. Suddenly Jan Paulus dropped into a squat, so that his eyes were on a level with those of the child. He took Dirk's face between the palms of his hands and studied it carefully. "Yes," he said, "this is the type of son she would breed. The eyes." His voice stumbled and stopped. A second longer he looked into Dirk's eyes, then he spoke again. "Be proud," he said, and stood up. Sean motioned at the flap of the tent, and thankfully Dirk scampered out to where Mbijani waited. "And now?" Jan Paulus asked. "I want passage through the lines." "You're going over to the English?" "I am English," said Sean. Frowning a little, Jan Paulus considered this before he asked, "You will give me your word not to take up arms with them?" "No," answered Sean, and Jan Paulus nodded. It was the answer he had expected. "There is a debt between us," he decided. "I have not forgotten the time of the elephant. This is full payment of that debt." He crossed to the portable desk and dipped a pen. Still standing, he wrote rapidly, fanned the paper dry, and proffered it to Sean. "Go," he said, "and I hope we do not meet again, for next time I will kill you." "Or I you," Sean answered him. Chapter 9. That afternoon Sean led his party across the steel railway bridge over the Tugela, on through the deserted village of Colenso and out again across the plain. Far ahead, sown on the grass plain like a field of white daisies, were the tents of the great British encampment at Chieveley Siding. But long before he reached it, Sean came to a guard-post manned by a sergeant and 4 men of an illustrious Yorkshire regiment. "Hello, Pete. And where the hell do you think you're off to?" "I'm a British subject," Sean informed them. The sergeant ran an eye over Sean's beard and patched coat. He glanced at the shaggy pony he rode, and then considered the direction from which Sean had approached. "Say that again," he invited. "I am a British subject," Sean repeated obligingly, in an accent that fell heavily on the Yorkshireman's ear. "And I'm a ruddy Japanese," agreed the sergeant cheerfully. "Let's have your rifle, mate." 2 days Sean languished in the barbed wire prison compound while the intelligence department cabled the registrar of births at Ladybird and waited for his reply. 2 long days during which Sean brooded incessantly, not on the indignities which had been inflicted on him, but on the woman he had found and loved and lost again so quickly. These 2 days of enforced inactivity came at precisely the worst moment. By repeating over and over in his imagination each word that had passed between them, by feeling again each contact of their hands and bodies, by forming her face in his mind's eye and gloating over every detail of it, Sean burned her memory so deeply into himself that it was there for all time. Although he did not even know her surname, he would never forget her. By the time he was released, with apologies, and given back his horses, rifle, money-bag and packs, Sean had driven himself into a mood of such overpowering depression that it could only be alleviated by liquor or physical violence. The village of Frere, which was the first station south on the line to the coast, promised both of these. "Take Dirk with you," instructed Sean. "Beyond the town, find a camp beside the road and make a big fire, so I can find you in the dark." "What will you do in Corsi?" Sean started towards the dingy little canteen that catered for the thirst of Frere. "I'm going there," he answered. "Come, Nkosazana." As he and Dirk continued on down the street, Mbijani was deciding how long he should give Sean before coming to fetch him. It was many years since the Nkosi had headed for a bar in such a determined fashion, but then there had been much to distress him these last few days. He will need until midnight, Mbijani decided. Then he will be in a condition conducive to sleep. From the door, Sean surveyed the interior of the canteen. A single large room with a trestle bar counter along the back wall, and the room was comfortably full of warmth and men and the smell of liquor and cigars. Still standing in the entrance, Sean slipped his hand into the pocket of his trousers and surreptitiously counted his money. 10 sovereigns he had allowed himself, more than sufficient for the purchase of the liquor he intended to consume. As he worked his way through the crowd towards the bar, he looked at the men about him, soldiers mostly, from a dozen different regiments, colonials and imperial troops, other ranks predominating, although a party of junior officers sat at a table against the far wall. Then there were a few civilians whom he judged to be transport drivers, contractors and businessmen, 2 women with the officers, whose profession was never in doubt, and a dozen black waiters. "What'll it be, Dux?" the large woman behind the counter asked as he reached it, and Sean regarded her moustache and her term of address with disfavour. Brandy. He was in no mood for the niceties. "You want the bottle, Dux?" She had recognised his need. "Well, that'll do for a start," he agreed. He drank 3 large brandies, and with a faint dismay knew that they were having no effect, apart from sharpening his imagination to the point where he could clearly see Ruth's face before his eyes, complete in every detail down to the little black beauty spot high on her cheek, and the way the corners of her eyes slanted upwards as she smiled. He would have to make a more active approach to forgetfulness. Leaning back, with both elbows on the counter and the glass clutched in his right hand, he studied the men about him once more, evaluating each of them as a source of distraction, and then discarding and moving his attention on. He was finally left with the small group around the gaming table. 7 players, the game draw poker, and from what he could see the stakes were modest. He picked up his bottle, crossed the room to join the circle of spectators, and took up his position behind a sergeant of yeomanry who was receiving a battering from the cards. A few hands later the sergeant drew one to fill his flush, missed, and pushed the bluff, raising twice until he was called by 2 pairs across the table. He threw his hand in and blew through his lips in disgust. "Yeah, that cleans me out." He gathered the few coins left on the table in front of him and stood up. "Rough luck, Jack. Anyone care to take his place?" The winner looked around the circle of spectators. "Nice friendly little game? Table stakes?" "Deal me in." Sean sat down, placed his glass and bottle strategically at his right hand and stacked 5 gold sovereigns in front of him. "The man's got gold. Welcome. Sean ducked the first hand, lost £2 to 3 queens on the next, and won £5 on the third. The pattern of his luck was set. He played with cold single-mindedness, and when he wanted cards, it seemed he had only to wish for them. What was the old adage? Unlucky in love, and the cards turn hot. Sean grinned without amusement, and filled a small straight with the 5 of hearts, beat down the 3 sevens that came against him, and drew the pot towards him to swell the pile of his winnings. Up about £30 or £40, he was enjoying himself now. A small school, gentlemen. 3 players had dropped out in the last hour, leaving 4 of them at the table. How about giving those losers a chance to recoup? You want to raise the stakes? Sean asked the speaker. He was the only other winner, a big man with a red face and the smell of horses about him. Transport rider, probably. Yeah, if everyone agrees, make the minimum bet £5. Suits me, grunted Sean, and there was a murmur of agreement around the table. With heavy money out, an air of caution prevailed at first, but slowly the game opened up. Sean's luck cooled a little, but an hour later he had built up his kitty on a series of small wins to a total of £75. Then Sean dealt a strange hand. The first caller on Sean's left raised before the draw, and was raised in turn by the gentleman with the horsey smell. Number 3 called, and Sean fanned his cards open. With a gentle elation, he found the 7, 8, 9, and 10 of clubs with a diamond 6. A pretty little straight dealt pat. Call your 20 and raise at 20, he offered, and there was a small stir of excitement among the onlookers. Call. Number 1 was short of cash. Call, echoed horse odour, and his gold clinked into the pot. I'm dropping. Number 3 closed his cards and pushed them away. Sean turned back to number 1. How many cards? I'll play with these. Sean felt the first premonition of disaster. And you? He asked horse odour. I'm also happy with what I have. 2 pat hands against his small straight, and from the suit distribution, Sean's 4 clubs. One of them would certainly be a flush. With a queasy feeling in his stomach, Sean knew he was in trouble, knew his hand to be a loser. Break the straight and go for the other club. Still not a certain winner, but the only thing worth trying. I'll draw one. He tossed the 6 of diamonds into the welter of discards and dealt to himself from the top of the pack. My bet. Number 1's face was glowing with confidence. I'll raise the minimum, another 40. Cost you £80 to look at me, boys. Let's see the colour of your money. I'd like to push you, but that's the limit. I'll call. Horse Odour's expression was completely neutral, but he was sweating in a light sheen across his forehead. Let me go to the books. Sean picked up his cards, and from behind the other 4, pressed out the corner of the table he had drawn. It was black. He opened it a little more. A black 6. Slowly he felt the pressure build up within him like a freshly fired boiler. He drew a long breath and opened the card fully. I'll call also. He spoke on a gusty, outgoing breath. Full house, shouted number 1. Queen's full, beat that, you bastards. Horse Odour slapped his cards down viciously, his red face crumpling in disappointment. God damn it, of all the filthy luck! I had an ace-high flush. Number 1 giggled with excitement and reached for the money. Wait for it, friend, Sean advised him, and spread his cards, face up upon the table. It's a flush. My full house beats you, protested number 1. Count the pips. Sean touched each card as he named them. 6, 7, 8, 9, and the 10, all clubs, straight flush. You come second by a day's march. He lifted number 1's hands off the money, pulled it towards him, and began stacking it in columns of 20. Pretty hot run of luck you're having. Horse Odour gave his opinion, his face still twisted with disappointment. Yes, agreed Sean. £268, very pretty. Funny how it comes to you on the big hands, Horse Odour went on, and especially when you're dealing. What did you say your profession was? Without looking up, Sean began transferring the stacks of sovereigns to his pocket. He was smiling a little. The end to a perfect evening, he decided. Satisfied that the money was secure, Sean looked up at Horse-Odour and turned that smile full upon him. "Come along then, laddie," he said. "It'll be a pleasure." Horse-Odour shoved his chair back and stood up. "It will indeed," agreed Sean. Horse-Odour led down the back stairs into the yard, followed by Sean and the entire clientele of the canteen. At the bottom he paused, judging Sean's footstep on the wooden stairs behind him. Then he spun and hit, swinging his body into the punch. Sean rolled his head, but it caught him on the temple, and he went over backwards into the crowd behind him. As he fell, he saw Horse-Odour jerk back the tail of his jacket and bring out the knife. It shone dull silver in the light from the canteen windows. Skinning knife, curved 8 inches of blade. The crowd scattered, leaving Sean lying on the stairs. And Horse-Odour came in to kill him, making an ugly sound, bringing the knife arching down from overhead, a clumsy, unprofessional blow. Only slightly stunned, Sean followed the silver sweep of the knife with ease, and the man's wrist slapped loudly into Sean's open left hand. For a long moment the man lay on top of Sean, his knife arm helpless in Sean's grip, while Sean assessed his strength, and with regret realized it was no match. Horse-Odour was big enough, but the belly pressed against Sean's was flabby and large, and the wrist in Sean's hand was bony, without the hard rubbery give of sinew and muscle. Horse-Odour started to struggle, trying to wrestle his knife arm free. The sweat dewed on his face and then began to drip. It had an oily, unpleasant smell like rancid butter that blended poorly with the odour of horses. Sean tightened his grip on the man's wrist, at first using only the strength of his forearm. "Ah!" Horse-Odour stopped struggling. Sean brought in the power of his whole arm, so he could feel his shoulder muscles bunching and writhing. "Jesus Christ! Jesus Christ!" Shrieking, as bone cracked in his wrist, Horse-Odour's fingers sprang open and the knife thumped onto the wooden stairs. Still holding him, Sean sat up, then came slowly to his feet. "Leave us, friend." Sean flung him backwards into the dust of the yard. He was breathing easily, still feeling cold and detached, as he looked down and watched Horse-Odour scrabbling to his knees, nursing his broken wrist. Perhaps it was the man's first movement towards flight that triggered Sean. Or perhaps it was the liquor he had drunk that twisted his emotions, aggravated his sense of loss and frustration, and channeled it into this insane outburst of hatred. Suddenly it seemed to Sean that here before him on the ground was the source of all his ills. This was the man who had taken Ruth from him. "You bastard!" he growled. The man sensed the change in Sean and scrambled to his feet, his face turning desperately from side to side as he sought an avenue of escape. "You filthy bastard!" Sean's voice rose, shrill with the strength of this new emotion. For the first time in his life, Sean craved to kill. He advanced upon the man slowly, his fists opening and closing, his face contorted, and the words that spilled from his mouth no longer making sense. A great stillness had fallen upon the yard. In the shadows the watchers stood, chilled with the dreadful fascination of it. The man was frozen also. Only his head moved, and no sound came from his open lips. And Sean closed in with the weaving motion of a cobra in erection. At the last moment the man tried to run, but his legs were slack and heavy with fear, and Sean hit him in the chest with a sound like an axe swung against a tree trunk. As he fell, Sean went in after him, straddling his chest, roaring incoherently, with only a single word recognizable, the name of the woman he loved. In his madness he felt the man's face breaking up under his fists, felt the warm splatter of blood thrown into his own face and onto his arms, and heard the shouts of the crowd. "He'll kill him! Get him off! For Christ's sake, give me a hand! He's as strong as a bloody ox!" Their hands upon him, an arm locked around his throat from behind, the shock as someone hit him with a bottle, the press of their bodies as they swarmed over him. With men clinging to him, 2 of them riding his back, and a dozen others on his arms and legs, Sean came to his feet. "Pull his legs out from under him! Get him down, man! Get him down!" With a convulsive heave, Sean swung the men on his arms into violent collision with each other. They released him. He kicked his right leg free, and those on his other leg let go and scattered. Reaching over his shoulders, he plucked the men off his back and stood alone, his chest swelling and subsiding as he breathed, the blood from the bottle gash in his scalp trickling down his face and soaking into his beard. "Get a gun!" someone shouted. "There's a shotgun under the bar." But no one left the circle that ringed him in, and Sean glared around at them, his eyes staring wildly from the plain of glistening blood that was his face. "You've killed him!" a voice accused him, and the words reached Sean through the madness. His body relaxed slightly, and he tried to wipe away the blood with the open palm of his hand. They saw the change in him. "Cool down, mate. Fun's fun, but the hell with murder. Easy now, easy now. Let's have a look at what you've done to him." Sean looked down on the body, and he was confused and then suddenly afraid. The man was dead. He was certain of it. "Oh, my God," he whispered, backing away, wiping at his eyes ineffectually and smearing blood. "He pulled a knife. Don't worry, mate. You've got witnesses." The temper of the crowd had changed. "No," Sean mumbled. They didn't understand. For the first time in his life he had abused his strength, had used it to kill without purpose, to kill for the pleasure of it, to kill in the manner in which a leopard kills. Then the man moved slightly. He rolled his head, and one of his legs flexed and straightened. Sean felt hope leap within him. "He's alive! Get a doctor!" Fearfully, Sean approached and knelt beside the man. He unknotted the scarf from around his own throat and cleaned the bloody mouth and nostrils. "He'll be all right. Leave him to the doc." The doctor came, a lean and laconic man chewing tobacco. In the yellow light of a hurricane lamp he examined and prodded, while they crowded close about him, craning to see over his shoulders. At last the doctor stood up. "All right, he can be moved. Carry him up to my surgery." Then he looked at Sean. "Did you do it?" Sean nodded. "Remind me not to annoy you." I didn't mean to. It just sort of happened." "Is that so?" The doctor shot a stream of yellow tobacco juice into the dust of the yard. "Let's have a look at your head." He pulled Sean's head down to his own level and parted the sodden black hair. "Nicked a vein. Doesn't need a stitch. Wash it, and then a little iodine." "How much, Doc, for the other fellow?" Sean asked. "You paying?" The doctor looked at him quizzically. "Yes." "Broken jaw, broken collarbone, about 24 stitches, and a few days in bed for concussion," he mused, adding it up. "Say 2 guineas?" Sean gave him 5. "Look after him, Doc." "Well, that's my job." And he followed the men who were carrying horse odour out of the yard. "I guess you need a drink, mister." "I'll buy you one," someone offered. "The whole world loves a winner." "Yes," agreed Sean. "I need a drink." Sean had more than one drink. When Imbijani came to fetch him at midnight, he had a deal of difficulty getting Sean up onto the back of the horse. Halfway to the camp, Sean slid off and subsided into the road, so Imbijani loaded him sideways, head and arms hanging over to port and legs dangling starboard. "It is possible that tomorrow you will regret this," Imbijani told him primly, as he unloaded him beside the fire and rolled him, still booted and bloody, into his blanket. And he was correct. Chapter 10. In the dawn, as Sean cleaned his face with a cloth dipped in a mug of hot water, regarding its reflection in the small metal mirror, the only fact that gave him the faintest satisfaction was the 200-odd sovereigns he had salvaged from the night's debauch. "Are you sick, Pa?" Dirk's ghoulish interest in Sean's condition added substantially to his evil temper. "Eat your breakfast." Sean's tone was calculated by its sheer malevolence to dry up further questioning. "There is no food." Imbijani fell into the familiar role of protector. "Why not?" Sean focused his bloodshot eyes upon him. "There is one among us who considers the purchase of strong drink and other things more important than food for his son." From the pocket of his jacket, Sean drew a handful of sovereigns. "Go," he ordered. Buy food and fresh horses. Go quickly, so that in my grave illness I may not be afflicted with the wisdom of your counsel. Take Dirk with you." Mbijani examined the money and grinned.
"The night was not wasted."
When they had gone back to Freya, Dirk trotting beside the huge half-naked Zulu, and his voice only fading at a distance of 100 yards, Sean poured himself another mug of coffee, and cupping it in his hands, he sat staring into the ash and pink coals of the fire. He could trust Mbijani to use the money with care. He had the bargaining patience peculiar to his race, that could, if necessary, devote 2 days to the purchase of a single ox. These things did not concern Sean now. Instead, he went over the events of the previous night. Still sickened by his display of murderous rage, he tried to justify it. Taking into account the loss of nearly all he owned, the accumulation of years of hard work that had been stripped from him in a single day, the hardship and uncertainty that had followed. And finally, he had reached the flash-point when liquor and poker-tensed nerves had snapped the last reserve in him and translated it all into that violent outburst. But that was not all. He knew he had avoided the main issue. Ruth. As he came back to her, a wave of hopeless longing overwhelmed him, a tender despair such as he had never experienced before. He groaned aloud, and lifted his eyes to the morning star, which was fading on the pink horizon as the sun came up behind. For a while longer he wallowed in the softness of his love, remembering the way she walked, the dark serenity of her eyes, and her mouth when she smiled and her voice when she sang, until it threatened to smother him in its softness. Then he sprang to his feet and paced restlessly in the grass beside the fire. "We must leave this place. Ride away from it. Go quickly. I must find something to do, some way to keep from thinking of it, something to fill my hands which ache now from the need to hold her." Along the road, going north to Colenso, a long column of infantry filed past him in the dawn. He stopped his pacing and watched them. Each man leaned forward against his pack, and the rifles stood up behind their shoulders. "Yes," he thought, "I will go with them. Perhaps at the place to which they march I can find what I could not find last night. We will go home to Ladyburg, riding hard on fresh horses. I will leave Dirk with my mother, then come back to this war." He began to pace again impatiently. Where the hell was Mbijani? From the heights above, Sean looked down on Ladyburg. The village spread in a neat circle around the spire of the church. He remembered the spire as beacon-bright in its cladding of new copper, but 19 years of weather had dulled it to a mellow brown. 19 years. It did not seem that long. There were goods yards around the station now, a new concrete bridge over the Baboonstrom. The blue gums in the plantation beyond the school were taller, and the flamboyants that had lined the main street were gone. With a strange reluctance, Sean turned his head and looked out to the right, across the Baboonstrom, close in against the escarpment, to where he had left the sprawling Dutch-gabled homestead of Tuniskraal, with its roof of combed yellow thatch and the shutters of yellow wood across the windows. It was there, but not as he remembered it. Even at this distance he could see the walls were flaking and mottled with patches of dampness. The thatch was shaggy as the coat of an Airedale. One of the shutters tilted sharply from a broken hinge. The lawns were brown and ragged where the bare earth showed through. The dairy behind the house had crumbled, its roof gone, and the remains of its walls jutted forlornly upwards to the height of a man's shoulder. "Damn the little bastard!" Sean's anger flared abruptly as he saw the neglect with which his twin brother had treated the lovely old house. "He's so lazy he wouldn't get out of bed he's peed in." To Sean it was not just a house. It was the place his father had built, which had sheltered Sean on the day of his birth and through the years of his childhood. When his father died under the Zulu spears at Islanzwana, half the farm and the house had belonged to Sean. He had sat in the study at nights with the logs burning in the stone fireplace and the mounted buffalo head above it, throwing distorted moving shadows up to the plaster ceiling. Although he had given his share away, yet it was still his home. Gary, his brother, had no right to let it decay and fall apart this way. "Damn him!" Sean voiced his thoughts out loud. Then almost immediately his conscience rebuked him. Gary was a cripple. His lower leg shot away by the blast of a careless shotgun. And Sean had fired that shotgun. Will I never be free of that guilt? How long must my penance continue? He protested at the goad of his conscience. That is not your only trespass against your brother, his conscience reminded him. Who sired the child he calls his son? Whose loins sowed the seed that became man-child in the belly of Anna, your brother's wife? It has been a long time in Corsi. Imbajani had seen the expression on his face as Sean looked towards Tunis Kraal, and remembered those things from the past that were better forgotten. Yes, Sean roused himself and straightened in the saddle. A long road and many years, but now we are home again. He looked back towards the village, searching the quarter beyond the main street and the hotel for the roof of that little cottage on Protea Street. As he found it, showing through the tall, fluffy blue gum trees, there was a lift in his mood, a new excitement. Did she still live there? How would she look? A little grey, surely. Had her 50 years marked her deeply, or had they treated her with the same consideration which she showed all those with whom she came in contact? Had she forgiven him for leaving without a farewell? Had she forgiven his long years of silence since then? Did she understand the reasons why he had never written? No word or message, except that anonymous gift of £10,000 he had transferred to her bank account. 10,000 miserable little pounds, which he had hardly noticed among all the millions he had won and lost in those days long ago when he was one of the lords of the Witwatersrand goldfields. Again the sense of guilt closed in upon him, as he knew with utter certainty that she had understood, that she had forgiven. For that was Ada, the woman who was his stepmother, and whom he loved beyond the natural love one owes their own full-blooded mother. "Let's go down," he said, and kicked his horse to a canter.
"Is this home, Pa?"
Dirk shouted as he rode beside him. "Yes, my boy, this is home."
"Will Grandma be here?"
"I hope so," Sean answered, and then softly, "Beyond all other things, I hope that she will." Over the bridge above the Baboonstrom, past the cattle pens alongside the line of rail, past the old wood and iron station buildings with the sign, white and black faded to grey, Ladyburg, altitude 2,256 feet above sea level, swinging left into the dusty main street, which was wide enough to turn a full span of oxen, and down to Protea Street, rode Sean and Dirk, with Mbijani and the pack mule trailing far behind. At the corner, Sean checked his mount to a walk, drawing out the last few minutes of anticipation until they stopped outside the wicket fence of white that encompassed the cottage. The garden was neat and green, gay with beds of Barberton daisies and blue rhododendrons. The cottage had been enlarged, a new room built on the far side, and it was crisp-looking in a coat of new whitewash. A sign at the gate said in gold letters on a green ground, "Maison Ada, high-class costumier." Sean grinned. "The old girl's gone all French, by God." Then to Dirk, "Stay here." He swung down from his horse, handed the reins to Dirk, and went through the gate. At the door he paused self-consciously and adjusted his cravat. He glanced down at the severe dark broadcloth suit and new boots which he had purchased in Pietermaritzburg, slapped the dust from his breeches, stroked his newly trimmed beard into place, gave his moustache a twirl, and knocked on the door. It was opened at last by a young lady. Sean did not recognize her. But the girl reacted immediately, flushing slightly, attempting to pat her hair into place without drawing attention to its disarray, trying to dispose of the sewing in her hands, and exhibiting all the signs of confusion peculiar to the unmarried female who finds herself suddenly and unexpectedly in the presence of a large, well-dressed and attractive male. But Sean felt a twinge of pity as he looked at her scarred face, ugly with the purple cicatrice of acne. Sean lifted his hat. "Is Mrs. Courtney here?"
"She's in the workroom, sir. Who shall I tell her is calling?"
"Don't tell her anything. It's a surprise." Sean smiled at her, and she lifted her hand self-consciously in an attempt to mask the ruin of her face.
"Won't you come in, sir?"
She turned her head aside shyly, as though to hide it. "Who is it, Mary?" Sean started at the voice from the depths of the cottage. It hadn't changed at all, and the years dropped away. "It's a gentleman, Aunt Ada. He wants to see you." "I'm coming. Ask him to sit down, and please bring us coffee, Mary." Mary escaped thankfully, and left Sean standing alone in the small sitting-room, twisting his hat in big brown hands, staring up at the daguerreotype print of Waite Courtney above the mantel. Although he did not recognise the fact, the face of his father in the picture was almost his own. The same eyes under heavy black brows, the same arrogance about the mouth, even the identical thrust of stubbornness in the jaw beneath the thick spade-shaped beard, and the big hooked Courtney nose. The door from the workroom opened, and Sean swung quickly to face it. Ada Courtney came through it smiling until she saw him. Then she stopped, and the smile died on her lips, and she paled. Uncertainly, her hand lifted to her throat, and she made a small choking sound. "Dear God," she whispered. "Ma," Sean fidgeted his feet awkwardly. "Hello, Ma. It's good to see you." "Sean!" The colour flooded back into her cheeks. For a moment I thought, "Oh, you've grown so much like your father. Oh, Sean!" And she ran to him, tossed his hat onto the sofa, and caught her around the waist as she came. "I've waited for you. I knew you'd come." Sean scooped her up and kissed her into a confusion of joy and laughter, swinging her while he did it, laughing himself. Put me down, Ada gasped at last. And when he did, she clung to him. "I knew you'd come back. At first there were bits in the newspaper about you, and people told me things, but these last years there's been nothing. Nothing at all." "I'm sorry." Sean sobered. "You're a bad boy." She was sparkling with excitement. Her hair had escaped from its bun, and a wisp of it hung down her cheek. "But it's so good to have you back." And suddenly she was crying. "Don't, Ma, please, don't." He'd never seen her cry before. "It's just that... It's the surprise." She brushed impatiently at her tears. It's nothing." Desperately, Sean sought something to distract her. "Hey!" he exclaimed with relief. "I've another surprise for you." "Later," she protested. "One at a time." "Oh, well, this won't wait." He led her to the door and out onto the front stoop, with his arm around her shoulders. "Dirk!" he shouted. "Come here!" He felt her standing very still as they watched Dirk coming up the garden walk. "This is your grandma," he introduced them. "Why is she crying?" Dirk eyed her with frank curiosity. Later they sat at the table in the kitchen while Ada and Mary plied them with food. Ada Courtney believed that the first thing to do with a man was to feed him. Mary was almost as excited as Ada. She had taken full advantage of the few minutes she had been alone, and now her hair was freshly brushed, and she wore a gay new apron. But the powder with which she had tried to cover the terrible disfiguration of the skin served only to call attention to it. In sympathy, Sean refrained from looking at her, and Mary noticed. Shyly, she devoted herself to winning Dirk's attention. She fussed over him quietly, and Dirk accepted this as the natural order of things. While they ate, Sean filled in the missing years for Ada, with a brief outline of his activities, glossing over the death of Dirk's mother and other things of which he had no reason to be proud. He came to the end of it. "And so, here we are. Home is the sailor home from the sea, and the hunter home from the hill. Dirk, don't put so much in your mouth and keep it closed when you chew. How long will you stay? Mary, see if there are any cream puffs in the jar. Dirk's still hungry," said Ada. "We'll make him sick." "I don't know. Not long enough. There's a war on, you know." "You going to join?" "Yes." "Oh, Sean, must you?" Knowing that he must. While he selected a cheroot from his case, Sean studied her closely for the first time. There was grey now, as he had known there would be, almost as much grey as black. Long streaks of it across her temples, and the texture of her skin had altered, losing the moisture of youth, drying out so that it creased around the eyes and stretched tight across her hands to show the knuckles more prominently and the blueness of the veins beneath it. She was plumper also. Her bosom was full and round, each breast having lost its separate identity in the whole. Yet the other qualities, whose memories he had treasured so long ago, still persisted, seemed indeed to have grown stronger. The composure which showed in the stillness of her hands and body, yet was given the lie by the humour that hovered around her lips. The eyes whose depths held compassion and a sure understanding of those things they looked upon. But mostly it was the indefinable aura of goodness about her. Looking at her, he sensed again that behind those eyes no destructive thought could live for long. Sean lit the cheroot and spoke, while the smoke masked his face. "Yes, Ma, I must go." And Ada, whose husband had ridden to war also, and not ridden home, could not prevent the sadness showing for an instant in her eyes. "Yes, I suppose you must. Gary has gone already, and Michael has been agitating to follow him." "Michael?" Sean fired the question. "Gary's son. He was born a short while after you left Ladybird. He will be 18 this winter." "Oh, what's he like?" Sean's voice was too eager. "Michael. So that is what my son is named. My firstborn. By God, my firstborn. And I didn't even know his name until he was almost fully grown." Ada was looking at him with her own question unasked in her eyes. "Mary, take Dirk through to the bathroom, please. Try and get a little of that food from around his mouth." When they had gone, she answered Sean's question. "He's a tall boy, tall and lean, dark like his mother, but a serious lad. He doesn't laugh much, always top of his class. I like him very much. He comes here often." She was silent for a moment. Then, Sean cut in. "And how's Gary?" He sensed what she was going to ask. "Gary has not changed very much. He's had a run of bad luck. Poor Gary, things have been bad on the farm. The rinderpest ravaged his herds. He had to borrow money from the bank." She hesitated an instant. "And he's drinking a lot these days. I can't be sure of it. He never visits the hotel, and I have never seen him take a drink. But it must be that." "I'll find out where he is when I go up to Colenso." "Oh, you'll have no difficulty finding him. Gary is a lieutenant colonel on the general staff. He was given promotion from major last week, and he has been awarded the Distinguished Service Order to go with his Victoria Cross. He's in charge of liaison between the Imperial and the colonial troops." "Good God!" Sean was stunned. "Gary a colonel?" "General Buller thinks very highly of him. The general is also a holder of the Victoria Cross." "But," Sean protested, "you know how Gary got that decoration. It was a mistake. If Gary is on the general staff, then Lord have mercy on the British Army. Sean, you mustn't talk about your brother that way." "Colonel Garrick Courtney!" Sean laughed out loud. "I don't know what there is between you and Gary, but it's something very nasty, and I don't want any of it in this house." Ada's tone was fierce, and Sean stopped laughing. "I'm sorry. Before we close the subject, I want to warn you. Please be very careful how you handle Gary. Whatever happened between you two, and I don't know what it was, Gary still hates you. Once or twice he started talking about you, but I stopped him. Yet I know it from Michael. The boy has picked it up from his father. It's almost an obsession with him. Be careful of Gary." Ada stood up. "And now about Dirk. What a lovely child he is, Sean, but I'm afraid you've spoiled him a little." "Yes, he's a tiger," Sean admitted. "What schooling has he been given?" "Well, he can read a little." "You'll leave him here with me. I'll enroll him when the school term begins." "I was going to ask. I'll leave money with you." 10 years ago there was a very large and mysterious deposit to my bank account. It wasn't mine, so I placed it out at interest." She smiled at him, and Sean looked guilty. "We can use that?" "No," he said. "Yes," she contradicted. "And now tell me when you're leaving." "Soon." "How soon?" "Tomorrow."